So my name's Lyndal Roper, and I'm Regis Professor of History here, and I'd like to welcome you all very warmly to the third of these Humanitas lecture events that are generously funded by Lord Weidenfeld and his foundation. We're grateful to them and to Torch for helping us do this, and in particular I'd like to thank, on behalf of all of us, James McDougall, who runs the programme and whose wide-ranging intellectual interests have made it a highlight that certainly I look forward to every year. And again, we're delighted to have Lynn Hunt here, Eugen Weber Professor of European History at UCLA. I'm really honoured to be able to introduce her. She's one of those historians where you always want to see what she's going to do next, because each thing that she does is a classic, and it changes the field, it changes how you think about things. I still remember the huge excitement where I first encountered her work and was reading her on the French Revolution, because, and I was reminded again on Monday what it was, it's that sense of how history can change people and your fascination with that, and the sense of movement, motion and change, which I really love in your work. She also wrote the family romance of the French Revolution, where she uses psychoanalytic ideas to interpret the nature of violence. And you might also have seen her recent work on human rights, a really challenging, interesting book that makes you think about biology, how texts work, and how people change. But she's also a brilliant essayist, and it's just a small thing that you did that I read in German on how historians understand time, but it's one of those essays that's always stayed with me. So we're really, really pleased that you are going to talk to us on the self. And Lynn has said that what she wants to do is throw out some ideas rather than do a sort of structured, carefully elaborated kind of argument, because we want you to respond. We want there to be spaces for people to feel that they have something to contribute. And I'm also very relieved, because my own contribution is not a structured, thought-through argument, but some ideas which are stimulated by Lynn's work and by the questions that were raised for this session. I'd also like to introduce Elleke Boehmer, who's Professor of World Literature here, and she's also a novelist, and her most recent one is Nile Baby from 2008. She's also published on women writers, and one of the things that characterizes her work is, I think, an interest in the self and how people use selves when they come from a different position, not from a sort of powerful position. And you may have seen her very short introduction on Nelson Mandela. It's really lively, stimulating, and a great read. So we're really pleased that she's one of the three discussants. And what we're going to do is each person is going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So thank you very much, Lynn.
Well, thank you all for coming, especially thank you those of you who are from the Early Modern World Seminar, and especially those who are facing the daunting prospect of their final papers, which I gather is in a very short time to come. I am incredibly gratified that you're willing to take some time out from worrying to come and think about yourself, as it were, at the topic of today. And I also want to thank James McDougall for all that he's done to make it possible for me to come for this wonderful week, and to thank Lyndal and Elleke for being willing to talk together in this format to kind of get going a conversation on things that are deeply interesting to all of us, but that we haven't had necessarily a chance to talk about certainly in this kind of format, or with each other about. Now, I'm going to try to be deliberately provocative and talk about why it is I'm interested in neuroscience and what it might have to do with history. I'm going to basically sort of throw out propositions as opposed to make a really sustained argument, 10 or 15 minutes not being much time for a sustained argument. These remarks in their full version are going to be published presumably in a forum in the American Historical Review on biology and history. But I don't want you to therefore assume that I have an entirely won over to the idea of biology and history as an ineluctable pair. There are many issues about this that we could discuss, but I thought it would be most fun to get them out on the table. Now, where I come from, actually, I got interested in neuroscience, this refers directly to Elleke, because I was interested in the effects of novel reading on brains. And when I wrote my book on human rights in the early 2000s, I argued that the reason novels had physical effects, physiological effects on their readers, and this was part of the reason they changed their views. So I got interested actually via the question of novel reading, most specifically in neuroscience. And I had gone to, it was one of those things where I went to a conference just to hear what was going on at Santa Barbara on neurology and narrative. And that sort of got me going, and I got interested in why historians were not interested, whereas the people in English literature were. So my first point is that historians are allergic to almost everything psychological. They are interested now, thanks in large measure to Foucault, though there are other influences as well, one of them being feminism. They are interested now in bodies, but they tend not to be interested in selves. Now, there are reasons for this. What I think happens with historians is that they assume they know what the self is and that it is not necessary to interrogate the category of the self. Now, why are historians allergic to things psychological? First of all, when I looked into this, it seemed to me quite striking that earlier historians, and I'm talking about historians right up to World War II, were in fact interested in psychological issues because they were interested in the articulation between the social and the psychological, in part because the great social theorists of the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century were deeply interested in the articulation between the social and the psychological. I'm thinking of Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, and of course Sigmund Freud. Right through Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, the founders of the Annales School, they were themselves personally deeply interested still in this issue. It drops out, therefore, I argue, in the post-World War II period with the rise of social history, and I believe this is because social historians felt that a social explanation validated the motives of women, workers, and various oppressed groups, whereas psychological explanations had been used in the past to denigrate these groups, calling them irrational, hysterical, out of control, so that social history became associated with a kind of anti-psychological position. And it became very common in this period, which was when I was a student in the 1960s, 1970s, to talk about psychological reductionism, which must be avoided, whereas social reductionism was never an issue on the agenda. And actually, it's reading Lyndal that got me interested in this many, many years ago about this as a problem for historians. Now, next proposition. Neither post-structuralism nor cultural history, with which I have been associated, changed this state of affairs. Why was this the case? Because in both cases, basically, the self, and this is what Lyndal has written about so compellingly, the self becomes the byproduct of discourse, the byproduct, that is, of social construction. It doesn't need interrogation because it follows from the way regimes of discourse work. And so, for me, I was very interested in this because I could see how this worked even in my own work, that I tended to always default to a social explanation of what was happening. So, enter my final point, which I'm going to linger on just slightly, neuroscience. Why neuroscience? Well, first of all, it seems to me that as historians, or whatever we are in the world of study, it's hard to ignore the fact that the two major domains of scientific work that have exploded in the last 20 years are DNA research and neuroscience. I was thinking about this, and I realized that in some ways one could argue that DNA research, especially studies of the human genome, but now increasingly of the animal genome as well, interestingly, DNA research has had a kind of historical corollary. There has been a great increase of interest in animal-human interactions in history in the last few years. Everywhere I go. I was just in Stockholm giving a talk. One of the people I met for the first time, I asked her what she was working on. She was working on wolves and the history of wolves and their interaction with humans. So in a sense, the DNA part has had a kind of influence, maybe not directly, but one can see a corollary in historical work. Not so much with neuroscience, and yet research on the brain has increased at least as dramatically as research on DNA. And this is in particular because of the development of new brain imaging techniques, especially the introduction of functional magnetic resonance imaging, what we call them MRIs, fMRIs, in the 1990s. I'm not going to go into that. We can talk about that later if you want. I'm hardly an expert on the subject of functional MRIs. They allow a kind of localized study of the brain. In the year 1992, this technique provided the experimental basis for 4 publications that year. By 2007, the rate reached 8 per day. It's now, the most recent time I looked at it, 19 publications per day. So don't ask me if I'm keeping up with the latest research in this area, because that's just on human subjects. There's a mountain of research being undertaken on slugs, being one of the most favored sites for research on the brain. Slugs, frogs, all kinds of animals are being studied. So this is a massive, massive field of study. Now, I am not proposing that we go find some grid in neuroscience that we can apply to historical study. Instead, I see it as a domain for kind of rethinking some of our assumptions. I do not see it as incompatible with psychoanalysis. In my past work, I have used psychoanalytic insights, not applying perhaps psychoanalysis in a very strict fashion. We could say I do psychoanalysis light, if you will. But there's no question that Freud himself was deeply informed by the neurological research of his time. Psychoanalysis was deeply connected with neuroscience, and I believe is now coming back into more conversation with it in our own time. So what I see neuroscience as interesting for is as the source of new metaphors for thinking about the self. And in particular, what I'm interested in is what is called the embodied self, which has roots in phenomenological philosophy. I find it striking that the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher, is being revived in recent times. I myself have been very much influenced by reading the phenomenological philosopher Sean Gallagher, who works with neuroscience, and reading the not phenomenologically influenced, though I think he should be, Antonio Damasio, who is at the University of Southern California nearby me in Los Angeles, and I have actually had a chance to meet him and talk about some of these issues with him. What is it about this phenomenological position, the embodied self, that matters? I think it comes down to 2 main things. That what is crucial to the self is the importance of a sense of ownership of one's body and of agency in action and cognition. That these elements are hardwired to some extent. They can be shown as existing in the case of a sense of ownership of one's body, some would argue, Gallagher would argue, in newborns, but are also subject to development through culture. It's not one or the other. The self comes out of these 2 fundamental things, which have to be understood as part of an embodied self, not a kind of rational self separate from the body, relating in some way separate from what goes on in the body. Now, what I find especially interesting about this is that the issues that have been coming up in this research and this point of view are very similar to issues brought up about Freud by a commentator on Freud who I think is very important, Michael Borch-Jakobsen. I'm not sure how you actually say his name, but I'll try that out for a start. Who criticized Freud for assuming the consciousness of the ego in order to explain its emergence. And so this is actually what's fascinating to me about studies of the self, which is how can you get at its emergence without assuming it already exists? Here's what he said about Freud. How is it that I may have a relation to my body as my body, my own body, if it is not by saying I, me, ego, ich? Are we not dealing much more probably with the ego agency, with that ego which Freud admitted he had not sufficiently studied? So this is very much the issue on the agenda about the self, but I think the things that people are thinking about it are of potentially great interest to us. How? And this is my final point. The embodied self, I think, points to a different rhetoric of analysis. Instead of the linguistic turn, with its emphasis on language, text, and representation as fundamental components in the construction of reality, which, by the way, tends to be turned into a notion of mind as computational, the vocabulary of embodiment calls attention to gesture, action, movement, and unconscious or tacit forms of knowledge. For me, experience is not just a linguistic event. Many kinds of knowing precede the acquisition of language and accompany it thereafter. In fact, learning a language and speaking it are prime examples of the subtle ways in which embodied selves are trained and act with agency in an interactive circuit. Emotions are such a compelling subject for analysis because they exemplify the kinds of interactive processes that embodied selves engage in. Emotions begin largely unconsciously, this is what Damasio has worked most on, and set in motion processes that become conscious at some point only to disappear as attention shifts elsewhere. And in fact, it was the history of emotions, I would argue, that first drew attention to the possible connections between neuroscience and cognitive psychology on the one hand and historical writing on the other. So those are my propositions to get us going, and we'll go on from there.
Terrific. Thank you, Lynn. I'm going to speak very much out of my own work because I'm also very interested in precisely these issues, and I'm very grateful to Lynn for setting them out so clearly. And I'm currently writing a biography of Martin Luther. And of course, that raises the questions of the self in a very powerful way, both because Luther is talking about himself all the time, and because Luther's self matters to the movement in a really significant manner. Biographies appear very early. Luther has about 3 or 4 attempts at doing his own biography as well, and often has biographical asides in his writing. And you couldn't read many of the key Reformation texts without seeing a picture of Luther on the cover, so that the reader approaches the text through an engagement with Luther's face. And of course, Luther has been one of the prime examples of psychoanalytically inspired biography, and those biographies, one by Erik Erikson, the other by Fromm, have become a byword for what psychoanalytically informed biography should not be. So it's been a real challenge to do this, and for me, I came to writing a biography of witchcraft, of Luther, by working on witchcraft, which is not the normal progression. And I've always been interested in subjectivity. And so I guess for me, the question is how you can use looking at an individual's subjectivity to relate that to the culture in which that individual lives. So what I'm going to present are really three thoughts, one on emotion, one on the body, and one on Luther's conception of childhood. And they're rather scattered, so let's see how this works. The emotion I wanted to think about, and Luther is a tremendously emotional writer and thinker, is anger, which I think is hugely important to Luther's creativity. And if you look at how the Reformation proceeds, it does so through a series of disputations, which are academic arguments staged between two sides, and they're a very ritualized way of expressing aggression. And it's through that that Luther works out his ideas, and I think they're absolutely essential to how this period of transformation happens and how people's emotions get engaged. And Luther is someone who can get extremely angry. One of the most interesting examples of that is what happens in Augsburg in 1518 when Luther meets Cajetan for a discussion which is meant to create a compromise which will mean that Luther doesn't move onto the track of being tried as a heretic. And Cajetan wants to treat him in a fatherly way. And this is not the way to approach Luther. He just gets outraged. So what had been set up very carefully politically as a conciliation becomes an argument and an expression of anger on Luther's part because he turns up with witnesses and notaries and does everything he can do to turn it into a confrontation, so much so that the Italian who's briefing him before he takes him to Cajetan says, "Do you want to hold a tournament? Do you want to hold a tournament?" And that is exactly what Luther wants to do. And I think that the role of anger in the early Reformation and his mockery, his absolutely withering scorn afterwards in his letters about Cajetan as a fatherly figure, is crucial to the way that Luther breaks out of older patterns of thinking. So I think this is a society that has a series of ways of expressing anger and of ritualizing it, and also one where Luther is himself aware that his expression of anger, is a fault, that he is too sharp. After all, anger was one of the 7 deadly sins. And here I absolutely agree with Lynn on the transformative power of emotion and about seeing the Reformation as not just an intellectual but an emotional event. There are emotions everywhere you turn. The second thing I wanted to think about was the body, and Luther, and I always worry that we use this term, that body, because it's an abstraction, and that's not what we mean. Luther is a great sufferer, and that dates right back to the time after the Diet of Worms, when he's made his big stand in front of the emperor and the whole estates of the empire. When he's away from all of that and is in protective custody in the Wartburg, in a castle hidden away from everyone. And he's reliant on his friend Spalatin, Georg Spalatin, who's also the middleman at the court. He's reliant on him both to provide him laxatives for his constipation and to get his manuscripts published. And for Luther, throughout, thinking about the physical self always involves thinking about pain and pleasure. And I just wanted to read you something that he says about the experience of having piles. He describes about how if it was mixed with blood, then there was a relief and almost pleasure in pooing, so that I was often inclined to defecate. And if it was touched with the finger, it itched pleasurably and the blood flowed. And this is in a letter, and he goes on to advise his correspondent, so don't stop the flow, let the blood out, because they say it is the golden artery, and it is indeed golden. It's said that everything evil to do with illness flows out. It's a dung gate for all illnesses, and those people live the longest. Now, I've used that piece because I think we find it quite shocking. It's a frankness about physical processes which is quite alien to us, and it's a use of eroticism that we also find just disturbing. But it makes sense in the context of how Luther experienced and understood his body and the constant need for the body to be in a flow with the outside. He does another thing which we also find weird. He kept a vein on his leg open as a way of dealing with his headaches. So he'd constantly scratch away to keep this wound open so that the noxious vapours in his head would come out. And how does Luther interpret all of this? Well, I think what's very interesting is that he sees it as the buffetings of Satan. And where I think other people, about whom some of you here have written about, where saints might be concerned and feel that there were attacks of the devil, for Luther it is these attacks of the devil which prove that Christ is on his side. Because if there were no attacks, then it wouldn't be worth the devil's while. The fact that it is worth the devil's while to attack him and to make him ill shows that he is with Christ. And he writes about them as the buffetings of Satan. So he writes to Melanchthon, "My health isn't constant, but because I see that it's not a natural illness, I am contemptuous of the buffetings of which the angel of Satan makes against my flesh. If I can't read and write, I can think and pray, and then really attack him." Again, you see that wonderful aggression. And so that's what Luther does right throughout his life. He interprets the illness to his friends. It makes up a large amount of his correspondence. He sees it as proof of his divine mission, and he also sees having this balance between inner and outer as being essential. And then the third point I wanted to make, have I got time to do that? Right. It's very hard to time yourself. And this is just something I wanted to say about childhood, because I think for anyone who's interested in psychoanalysis, we think of childhood as being the key to an individual's biography in some way or other. And what is fascinating is that Luther is also interested in his own youth. And so in 1529, he goes back to Eisenach, where he had been a schoolboy, and he hears about a monk who was in Eisenach when he was young, a certain Johannes Hilton, who had made prophecies and who had been very critical of monasticism. So he hears about this and he is very excited and he wants to find out as much as possible about this man. But what he does with it is where we would interpret from the childhood forward, except though of course psychoanalytically it is a projection backwards and a reworking and an invention, what Luther does in a sense is similar. He reads it as proof of his prophetic mission, because Hilton had said that someone would come and attack monasticism, and the date pointed to 1516. Okay, it was a year out, but it was pretty close. And Luther wants that confirmation of his role. So does this show that these people can't think about the importance of the psychic realm, and so they have to think about other kinds of prophecy? No, I don't think it does show that, because this incident gets then taken up in the Augsburg Confession of Faith of 1530 in a passage which is about the evil of the monks and is also proving Luther's prophetic status. But that passage is crucially about his relationship with his father. And I think that memory is about that as well, and that's part of his significance. So that Luther's prophetic role is fundamentally related to his father's questioning of that prophetic role, and that's part of the story of which all of this is part. And it's Luther's way of thinking about that past. So to just draw these scattered thoughts together, I think that emotions are really important to any intellectual history, and they're a very good diagnostic tool. If one looks for the emotions, you often can see things that are going on that you might not otherwise see. But I don't think that emotions in themselves offer an explanatory framework. So I think they're useful diagnostically, really important to see and to use, but I think they themselves don't provide an explanation. The other thing I think is that Luther really does think through his body. He's a very, what I've learned from Luther really is just how important physical experience can be and how one needs to think about that in relation to the self at all levels, just because he's such a challenging thinker on all of that, right through to his insistence on the real presence in the Eucharist. And then Luther is interested in childhood but reads it forward to confirm the future rather than to explain the past or the present. But that is also, in a way, how he thinks about himself. I think that the language of self and individual biography is central to the Reformation, and it's not an invention of a later period. And so I think that there are always selves. I don't see a point at which the self comes into being in European culture. And I think what I would want to do, and why I found this work so interesting, is that working on Luther constantly challenges me to think about my own categories and to always think critically about the way in which I might use psychoanalysis or might use other understandings of how texts work. Thanks.
I'm going to shift the focus a little, or take Lynn's linguistic turn back to narratives, representations, and images, and draw our attention once again to the title that we gathered under and talking about today, Histories of the Self. And I want to put the emphasis on stories of the self, and see where we go with that. I also have some scattered thoughts here, which are in part informed by my work in narrative, both in writing the short biography of Mandela that Lyndal mentioned, and that will inform many of my remarks today, but also my work in narrative theory, and then also my work as a narrateur, as a novelist. I'm particularly interested in all my work coming at this concept from different angles in the modern self, and this question which Lyndal has just put the other way around, this question of whether the self, or the individual self, the individualist self, is the creation of modernity. My work for many years has been informed by Charles Taylor's remarkable book. Charles Taylor was here talking in Oxford 2 days ago, and unfortunately I missed the talk. Maybe there are those of you in the audience who heard him. He was talking about religion. But my focus here now, the reason why I'm mentioning him, is because of his remarkable book, The Sources of the Self, where he talks about self-creation and a preoccupation with self, and that question of what and who am I, what is myself, and how do I legitimate that self, how do I bring that self into being. He argues in that book, there's something that comes along, the pertinence of the question, the urgency of the question, and the predominance of the question comes about with the crumbling of religious belief. So it is preeminently a question of the Romantic period, the question that Romantic writers are concerned with. And of course, if we think of any of the classic Romantic texts, but perhaps Wordsworth's Prelude in particular, about which I think it was John Stuart Mill who said, no man has ever written so much about himself. He said in critique of Wordsworth's Prelude. But what he is concerned with there, across those many, many books of his Prelude, is how myself came into being, what it was that formed myself, the imagination, which is of course for Wordsworth the core of the self. And it is so interesting, and that really is my bottom line this evening. It is so interesting that he is only able to ask those questions by narrating formative stories, self-making stories from his childhood and from his young adulthood. So the question I'd like to put to all of us, which we could perhaps ask ourselves as we're thinking our way through some of these concepts, is what is the story that we all tell about ourselves? What is our core narrative? What is the core narrative that comes out of our self-love? And what is the story through which we legitimate what we do, the work that we do? Those two stories aren't always coincident in many people, and they certainly were not coincident in the life of Nelson Mandela. So from my work on that biography and of getting to, if you like, the story of the self of an individual who was for a long period of his life incarcerated and completely out of the public view, and then who, when he was a working politician, activist and politician, was always in the public eye, always, as it were, at the surface of his being, at the surface of his self, in relation to others. What story of that self could I tell was the questions I confronted in that biography, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But from my work on that, but also on the key post-colonial leaders of the Indian independence movement, Nehru and Gandhi, I developed a particular interest in thinking about the generic shapes, so the story forms through which those lives were represented, both through how they were represented by biographers and by promoters and by colleagues and other politicians, but also by how those characters, Mandela and Nehru in particular, represented themselves, the story forms through which they came across. I try to capture this under the heading of good leaders tell good stories. And it very much is the case that the most charismatic of political leaders, and it right or left of the political spectrum regardless, the most charismatic of political leaders find compelling stories or myths through which to present themselves to constituencies and audiences. But I think that this point can be applied to life writing and to how we present ourselves more broadly, in the sense that most narrated lives, so biographies and autobiographies, but possibly also all life stories, as in that narrative of ourselves that is constantly sort of playing itself in our minds as we go about our daily life. All these narrated lives correspond to or fall into the pattern of certain well-known story forms. And most obviously, and this is one that very much relates to the example of Nelson Mandela, partly because he was a mission-educated child, most obviously and commonly the story of the quest or the pilgrimage, the long walk to freedom, which is told in a stage-by-stage form and takes an upward trajectory to the achievement of a kind of unity, a kind of identification between the self, the leader's self, and the group, or the nation in this case. It may well also apply in the case of Martin Luther. Another version of that, they're very, very similar. It's just a question of emphasis, really, is the motif or the story form of the journey, which has now become a kind of X Factor, Britain's Got Talent kind of cliche. I've been on an amazing journey. When you lose out to the person who wins. It's a compensatory. A lot of these stories they're not only legitimating, they also can be compensatory stories. In more special cases, the story of promise cut short, or alternatively of late flowering, or of the endless childhood, the childhood never comes to an end, or of the reclusive genius, or of the many stories of in a mathematics building of famous mathematicians or of great scientists, but in particular mathematicians are of the reclusive, the autistic genius. And interestingly, and this is a perception that I take from the novelist Claire Massoud, who was also visiting Oxford this week. And she said, you know, the myth of the mad, autistic, reclusive genius isn't as available to women artists and women mathematicians and others as it is to men. And that is something that really struck me, and it helped me in thinking about Virginia Woolf, of whom it is so often said, but she was mad for some of the time. But, you know, we don't say this in the same way of someone like Handel, who was bipolar. You know? So that's something to... those are... It's just by way of demonstration that there are certain sort of dominant and influential and very compelling and persuasive story forms through which lives are presented, sometimes self-presented and narrated. I think what this shows us is, and I take this perception from the novelist Anthony Poe, what's true is not necessarily what happened, but what we say happened, what we remember, and how we tell the story of what we remember. It's not what happens to people that is significant, but what they think happens to them, what corresponds to that constant story, that kind of babble, that episodic babble that is constantly running through our brains. And of course, neuroscience is absolutely crucial in understanding some of the concepts and the images that shape that babble. So the interesting question, too, then, is how and through what means these stories emerge and evolve. Who generates the stories? In the case of biography, it's obvious, it's the biographer. But in the case of autobiography, it's a very interesting question. In the case of the life written by the person who has lived the life, has that story come from a reflection through the lens of myth upon the life, or has it come through the ways in which that person has conceived of himself or herself through the eyes of others? Just a few more concrete examples. Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was from an elite and high-caste Indian family, educated abroad in England, found it necessary to present his autobiography, to present to the Indian people, firstly, in the form of an autobiography, first the book called An Autobiography, and then also a kind of a companion book, The Discovery of India. He found it necessary to present himself in the form of a journey of self-discovery, which was also the story of a growing attachment to India. So his story, to a certain extent, corresponds to the prodigal son story. He was alienated from the nation, and then through a stage-by-stage process of becoming a politician, of becoming an activist, of joining Gandhi's non-cooperation movement, of becoming a kind of servant to Gandhi, through this stage-by-stage process, and then also traveling around India and meeting multiple Indian constituencies, he reconciles to India. He becomes the son of India. He's not born as the son of India. He becomes the son of India, and he traces this narrative through those two books. Through telling his tale in an autobiography in particular, he seeks corroboration as a leader in the eyes of the Indian masses. It's very, very clear that he's doing this in writing that text. In Mandela's case, we have a far less introspective leader, but he had from young adulthood the knack of presenting himself as a quintessential modern self. As I was saying, mission-educated, hard-working, individualist, aspirational, and always a model to others. It was a very, very compelling story, very, very persuasive in the apartheid context, where educational and other structures disallowed black people from identifying in this way, from identifying as a modern self. It was seen as a contradiction in terms for a black African to identify as a modern self, as telling the story of a rising trajectory of greater social success and of educational achievement. And it's interesting that when he comes out of incarceration after his 27.5 years, he, to some extent, continues to represent in those ways as a figure who is identified with the group, who develops his identity through relating to the group or the nation, but who is also a standout, a standalone figure, who has, as it were, made himself and presents that story of self-help as his definitive story, as his legitimating story. I think I've probably said enough, but I do feel I should kind of end by going back to marginalized groups, minority groups, and which Lyndal also mentioned in connection with some of my work, and to encourage us to think about what kinds of stories are available to such groups. In writing women's biography, what are the story forms through which those lives take shape? And if the legitimating stories aren't available in the same sorts of ways to those groups, how can they be made available? What are the processes through which that self-representation, that self-legitimation takes place? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Elleke.